The Flaxborough Ladies' Benevolent Society prided itself on two things: its ability to raise modest sums for worthy causes, and its ability to quarrel about the means of doing so. Both traditions stood in full bloom on the crisp Saturday morning of its annual charity bake sale, held in the parish hall beneath a large banner that proclaimed goodness through cake. The banner sagged slightly in the center, as though embarrassed by the optimism of its message. Rows of trestle tables were pushed together and draped in patterned cloths, upon which the women of the town had placed their offerings. Sponge cakes, jam tarts, shortbread rows as straight as regimental lines, and courtesy of Mrs. Felicity Hardstyle, a lemon drizzle so glistening that one or two attendees wondered aloud whether it might be varnished. Beside these exemplary contributions lay something far less triumphant. It was Mrs. Brock's home who first noticed. She had been drifting along the tables in a state of mild grievance, as was her custom when she halted, peered down, and made a small, choking sound, as though moral outrage had caught in her throat. "Marjorie," she hissed to her companion, "just look at those." Marjorie Wymington, a woman who could investigate scandals at 20 paces, leaned in. Good heavens, they're crooked. Indeed, the cupcakes before them, a neat batch of 12 arranged in hopeful rows, were undeniably lopsided. Each cake leaned at an angle, as though attempting to escape the paper case in which it had been baked. Their icing, intended to be a cheerful swirl of pink, sloped off toward one side in a manner that suggested deep personal disappointment. Crooked cupcakes were not in themselves a crime. But in Flaxborough, where the standards of domestic presentation were commonly held to be close to sacred, such an affront could not be ignored. The cake's creator, Mrs. Eunice Lavender, was not present to defend them. Eunice was a timid woman who avoided situations in which criticism might be delivered directly to her face, and having delivered her cupcakes at precisely 9:01 a.m., she had fled with the air of someone escaping a house fire. By 9:10, the crooked cupcakes had become the most discussed item in the hall. By 9:12, someone had suggested sabotage. By 9:14, Mrs. Brock's home had declared that Eunice Lavender, poor mousy creature though she was, had never produced such uneven baking in her life. A theory began to circulate hesitantly at first, then with increasing relish, that someone had interfered with Eunice's cakes after they were delivered. Why one would do so remained an open question, but Flaxborough was a town in which motives rarely aligned with reason. At 9:20, calamity struck more definitively. Reverend Biddlecombe, in his eagerness to demonstrate support for the charitable endeavor, selected one of the offending cupcakes, bit into it, paused, frowned, and then discreetly, though not discreetly enough, deposited the remainder into a nearby napkin. His expression fell somewhere between theological confusion and mild alarm. "Odd flavor," he murmured, wiping his lips. "Very odd." Mrs. Brock's home pounced. "Odd, Reverend?" "Odd how?" The Reverend, who feared confrontation almost as much as he feared committee meetings, hesitated. "Well, metallic, perhaps. Or fizzy." The word fizzy traveled like wildfire. Within minutes, a whisper spread. The cupcakes had been tampered with. Something added. Something strange. Something that, depending on who embellished the tale, ranged from bicarbonate excess to a sinister chemical one might expect to find in a gardening shed. By 9:45, Mrs. Hardstyle demanded the police be informed. By 9:47, Mrs. Wymington had agreed, adding that the integrity of the entire bake sale, and by extension the town's reputation for culinary decency, was now in question. Thus it was that Inspector Walter Purbright, enjoying what he had hoped would be a quiet morning reviewing a minor case of bicycle theft, received a call from Sergeant Malice, whose voice held the strangled politeness of a man attempting not to laugh. "Sir, we've had a complaint from the parish hall." "Of what nature, Sergeant?" Perbrite asked, bracing himself for something to do with lost raffle tickets. "Well-tampered cupcakes." Perbrite closed his notebook. "Tampered. Yes, sir. Crooked ones. Apparently they've caused something of an upset. I see. A pause. Better have a look. When Perbrite arrived at the parish hall, he found a cluster of townsfolk gathered around a trestle table as though examining archaeological evidence. The crooked cakes sat at the center of attention, looking faintly ashamed of themselves. Mrs. Hardstyle greeted him with a severity usually reserved for tax inspectors. "Inspector, thank goodness. We need your guidance. There has been interference, deliberate interference." Perbrite studied the cupcakes with mild interest. "In what way, Mrs. Hardstyle?" "In every way," she replied, as though that settled it. "Just look at them." He did. They were undeniably crooked. And yes, when he leaned in, there was a faint scent that did not belong to the usual ingredients of home baking. Something effervescent. Something inappropriate. "Sergeant," he murmured, "secure these cakes for examination, if you would. Best not let anyone else sample them." Mally nodded, though his expression suggested he had no intention of tasting one himself. The crowd watched eagerly, as though expecting Perbrite to announce the culprit on the spot. But Perbrite merely folded his hands behind his back and surveyed the scene with calm patience. Sabotage, in Flaxborough, was rarely a matter of great violence. More often, it took the form of social humiliation, quiet, thorough, and devastating. Who would wish to disgrace Mrs. Eunice Lavender? Or perhaps more tellingly, who would profit from her disgrace? Perbrite felt the first gentle stirrings of interest, the investigator's equivalent of raising an eyebrow. Something here was not quite right. Something small, something petty, something very Flaxborough indeed. And so the matter of the crooked cupcakes, absurd as it might have seemed elsewhere, became Inspector Purbright's newest enquiry. The parish hall had not grown any quieter since Perbright's arrival. If anything, the air had thickened with the peculiar tension produced when respectable citizens believed themselves to be at the center of a criminal drama. Even those who had originally come only to buy a modest sponge now loitered with the firm intention of observing every movement the inspector made. It gave the scene an ambience somewhere between a bake sale and a theatrical rehearsal. Perbrite, who had long accepted that Flaxborough residents preferred an audience to an answer, allowed his gaze to travel calmly along the tables. The crooked cupcakes sat in Sergeant Mally's evidence box, looking more forlorn by the minute. Mrs. Hardstyle hovered beside them, arms folded in the manner of a woman who expected to be vindicated by the mere force of her indignation. "Inspector," she said, lowering her voice as if the cakes themselves might overhear, "I do hope this will be taken seriously. Sabotage reflects very poorly on our town." Perbrite inclined his head. "Indeed, Mrs. Hardstyle, the dignity of Flaxborough's baked goods must be preserved at all costs." Several listeners stifled uneasy chuckles, uncertain whether he was joking. His interest, however, drifted toward the door, specifically toward the anxious figure slipping in through it. Eunice Lavender, clutching her handbag like a shield, paused on the threshold as though deciding whether retreat might still be possible. Her eyes widened at the sight of Perbrite. She froze. Perbrite approached her with the unhurried politeness that often coaxed more truth from citizens than direct questioning ever could. "Mrs. Lavender," he said gently, "perhaps you could spare a moment." A collective hush fell, for Flaxborough adored nothing more than the illusion of scandal, especially involving someone as chronically harmless as Eunice. She nodded, swallowing visibly. "Inspector, I heard there was some trouble. They told me my cupcakes that something was wrong with them." "More wrong than usual?" Mrs. Broxholm whispered loudly, earning a warning glance from Perbrite. He guided Eunice a few steps aside, enough to offer privacy without discouraging the inevitable eavesdroppers. "You delivered them yourself?" he asked. "Yes, at 9 o'clock. Well, 9:01. I was delayed because my neighbor's cat had got into the dustbin again." Her voice fluttered like a loose curtain in a draught. They looked perfectly ordinary when I left them. And did anyone see you place them on the table?" I spoke to Mrs. Wilmington briefly. She said the icing seemed rather glossy, but I thought she was joking. Perbrite's quiet attention encouraged a fuller confession. Eunice lowered her eyes. "Inspector, I know they're not the prettiest, but they weren't crooked when I brought them." "Truly?" Perbrite nodded, filing away the tremor in her tone, not fear of guilt, but fear of humiliation. In Flaxborough, the latter could be far more motivating. "Mrs. Lavender," he continued softly, "is there anyone who might have wished your contribution to fare poorly?" Eunice blinked. "Oh no, I shouldn't think so. I'm not important enough to be disliked." "On the contrary," said Perbrite, "importance is not always a prerequisite for becoming the target of irritation." Before she could respond, Sergeant Mallet approached with a slip of paper and his usual expression of earnest bafflement. "Inspector, preliminary check on the cakes. No toxic substances, but there's a considerable amount of citric acid mixed into the icing, enough to make it curdle and slide. And the flavor, well, Reverend Biddlecombe wasn't imagining things." This prompted a ripple of scandalized murmurs. Mrs. Broxholm clutched her handbag as though the revelation constituted personal betrayal. "Citric acid," repeated Perbrite. "Not something one typically sprinkles onto cupcakes." "No, sir, unless one was trying to clean a kettle." Perbrite thanked him and turned back to Eunice, who had paled even further. "I didn't use anything unusual," she breathed. "Only my usual icing sugar and coloring." "Where do you keep your ingredients?" Perbrite asked. "In the cupboard above the sink." "Oh, but well," Eunice hesitated, twisting her fingers. "My cousin Harold visited 2 nights ago. He can be rather careless with things. He borrowed a jar of sugar and said he needed it for his lemonade stand at the church fete stall he's organizing. He brought it back yesterday. Perhaps he mixed them up." Perbrite stored this tidbit carefully, though something about her explanation lacked crucial weight. It did not feel incorrect, only incomplete. He thanked Eunice and let her retreat, which she did with palpable gratitude. Mrs. Hardstyle swooped in the moment she was out of earshot. "Inspector, surely you see what this implies. Carelessness, sabotage, something deliberate. This could reflect terribly upon the society." "Quite so," Perbrite murmured. "But before we leap to conclusions, it may be beneficial to determine who had access to the table after Mrs. Lavender placed her cakes." This suggestion provoked a lively debate among those present, each attendee eager to recall the precise positions of all others that morning. According to the women nearest the entrance, Mrs. Wilmington had been the first to approach the cupcakes. According to Mrs. Wilmington, Mrs. Hardstyle herself had hovered near them for several minutes, purely in supervisory capacity, of course. Mrs. Hardstyle countered that Mrs. Broxholm had been rearranging items with suspicious enthusiasm. As for Mrs. Broxholm, she reminded everyone that her eyesight made it impossible for her to notice anything so subtle as icing. Each accusation was polite, indirect, and delivered with the refined sharpness of a well-honed dessert fork. Perbrite listened, his gaze thoughtful, until a small observation emerged. The cupcakes were placed on a corner table, one that stood next to the box of assorted utensils and decorative items the society used each year: ribbons, doilies, spare cutlery, and a collection of miscellaneous tins that no one had sorted in living memory. A quiet oddity stirred in Perbrite's mind, not yet forming a solid idea, but lingering nevertheless. "Sergeant," he said at last, "I believe we should have a closer look at that supply box." The room leaned collectively toward them, like villagers awaiting a prophecy. Perbrite, however, lifted the lid with no display of haste. Inside lay the usual assortment of ribbons, lace frills, tea towels of varying age. But among them was something else. A small, half-full container labeled citric crystals for household use. Mrs. Hardstyle gasped as if presented with a weapon. Mrs. Wilmington declared she had never seen such a thing in her life. Mrs. Brock's home insisted it must have been left by last year's committee, who were, in her opinion, sloppy. Perbrite said nothing. He merely noted the fine dusting of powder on the rim, as though the container had been handled recently. Someone had tampered with the cupcakes, and they had done so at the bake sale itself. Perbrite closed the container gently, his expression serene. "Sergeant," he murmured, "I believe our inquiry has only just begun." Sergeant Malley held the container of citric crystals as though it were an unexploded device, careful not to tilt it for fear the mere suggestion of spillage might incite another round of communal gasps. Perbrite accepted it with a nod, his expression mild but attentive, as though he were considering not only its presence but the peculiar social currents that had allowed it to be here at all. The chatter in the hall rose and fell in anxious waves. Flaxborough's residents sensed that a deeper mystery had emerged, though they could not yet decide whether to be alarmed or delighted. Perbrite's gaze swept the trestle table where Eunice's cupcakes had originally sat. Nothing else appeared disturbed, though the paper cases had left faint marks, slight indentations that suggested the cakes had been moved, perhaps turned, before the icing slumped into its crooked disgrace. Such minute details rarely lied, but they never volunteered their truth without gentle coaxing. He folded the container lid securely and addressed Mallet. "We'll return this to the station for proper examination, and let's keep it quiet if possible. The situation doesn't require further excitement." Unfortunately, excitement had already rooted itself into the collective imagination of the bake sale attendees. Mrs. Perwin, who had joined the gathering late and was therefore uninformed, asked loudly what the inspector had found. 3 people gave 3 different answers, all embellished. Mallet winced. Perbrite chose not to intervene. He understood the economy of gossip. Attempting to correct it was an expense rarely worth the trouble. Instead, he stepped toward the doorway, giving the hall a final, thoughtful survey. Eunice Lavender had slipped into a chair near the far wall, looking as though she wished to dissolve into the upholstery. Mrs. Hardstyle was already reorganizing the surviving baked goods with the solemnity of an archivist preserving a historical collection. And Mrs. Wymington had assumed an air of investigative authority, recounting her version of events with dramatic pauses. Perbrite paused beside Eunice before leaving. "Mrs. Lavender," he said in his quiet, even tone, "if you recall anything unusual, no matter how small, please telephone me." She nodded rapidly. "Inspector, do you really think someone did this on purpose?" He hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from kindness. "I think it's best not to assume the worst, but neither should we dismiss the possibility. A great deal of mischief emerges from very small grievances." She considered this, her anxiety shifting into uneasy reflection. "I suppose people do get cross about the strangest things." "Indeed," Perbrite murmured. "Sometimes the smallest matters produce the sharpest frictions." He left the hall with Malley following, the evidence box tucked neatly beneath the sergeant's arm. Outside the air was crisp, scented faintly with the early promise of spring. The church clock struck 10, each chime ringing with the measured patience Perbrite himself often displayed. "Sir," Malley began, once they had reached the pavement, "do you think it really is sabotage? Seems a bit overboard for a bake sale." Perbrite gave him a thoughtful look. "Sergeant, in Flaxborough there is no such thing as overboard. Only varying degrees of enthusiasm." Malley snorted softly. "I'll take that as a yes." Perbrite smiled, though faintly. "Consider the circumstances. The crystals weren't merely present. Someone had used enough to alter the flavor noticeably, not an accident. And look where the container was found. In the supply box, right next to where the cupcakes were set." "Exactly. Which means either extraordinary coincidence or deliberate placement." Malley frowned. "But who'd want to target Mrs. Lavender?" "She's harmless." Perbrite's brows rose. "Sergeant, harmlessness is often a provocation. To some minds, at least, those who feel overlooked sometimes resent those who never trouble anyone at all. This remark puzzled Mally, who decided not to question it further. They took the short walk to the station, where Perbrite deposited the crystals for analysis. He gave instructions to have the fingerprints checked, though in Flaxborough such a test was more symbolic than practical, given how often items passed through communal hands. Still, a symbol could sometimes be surprisingly revealing. After jotting a few notes in his ledger, Perbrite stood at the window, overlooking the high street. People moved along the pavement with customary briskness, though with occasional glances toward the parish hall. The bake sale, despite its modest aim, was now the hottest source of intrigue in town. Word would spread quickly, shaping itself as it went. Mally approached with a fresh pot of tea. "Sir, Mrs. Hardstyle's already rung the station twice. She wants assurances that the investigation won't, quote, undermine her committee's authority." Perbrite accepted a cup. "Reassure her that her authority is in no danger whatsoever." Mally scribbled a note. "Should I send someone to speak with Harold Lavender? If he's the one who swapped the sugar jar." "That may be worthwhile," Perbrite said, "though I suspect his involvement may prove to be circumstantial rather than central." The crystals came from the supply box, not from her kitchen cupboard. Harold might have muddled her ingredients, yes, but not in this particular manner. Mally paused. "So whoever did it had to be at the hall this morning before the cakes were noticed?" "Precisely." Perbrite took a slow sip of tea, allowing the warmth to settle his thoughts. "And consider the timing. Eunice delivered her cupcakes at 9:01. The problem was noticed at 9:15. That gives us 14 minutes, Mally supplied. 14 minutes in which someone could have approached that table unnoticed. Mally shifted uneasily. "Don't narrow it down much, sir." "No," Perbrite agreed. "But it tells us the person felt confident acting in a public setting. Sabotage performed so close to discovery suggests a motive not tied to concealment, but to embarrassment. Humiliation," Mally said slowly. "Exactly." A silence fell as the two men absorbed this. In Flaxborough, humiliation was a far more potent tool than harm. Mally set down his cup. "I suppose we'll need a list of everyone who walked near that table." "Yes, and more importantly, why they did so." Before Mally could respond, the station telephone rang. He answered, then turned to Perbrite with a slightly bewildered expression. "It's Mrs. Perwin, sir. She says there's been another incident at the bake sale. Something about the raffle table." Perbrite raised an eyebrow. "Another incident? Already?" Mally nodded. "She says someone's tampered with the prize list." Perbrite set down his tea. "Well, Sergeant, it appears our morning promises to be even more enlightening than expected." Together, they stepped out once more into the still, bright morning, and the crooked cupcakes, it seemed, were only the beginning. By the time Perbrite and Sergeant Mally arrived back at the parish hall, the sense of genteel disorder had grown noticeably sharper. The bake sale no longer resembled a cheerful village event, but something far closer to a small-scale parliamentary crisis, with factions forming around tables and opinions hardening into competitive theories. Mrs. Perwin, the displeased herald of the new incident, waved them forward with all the urgency of a woman who had not been properly listened to in years. "Inspector, thank goodness you've come again. The raffle table has been interfered with." Completely muddled. Sabotaged, in fact. Perbrite regarded her steady agitation with polite interest. "What precisely has been altered, Mrs. Perwin?" "The prize list," she declared, thrusting a clipboard toward him. "Someone has switched the descriptions around. Look for yourself." He accepted the clipboard. It displayed a list of modest prizes: bath salts, a tin of biscuits, a decorative candle, and, rather optimistically, a weekend voucher for a bed and breakfast in Grimsdyke. At first glance, all seemed in order. Then he noticed that several descriptions did not match their assigned numbers. The biscuits were described as handmade laced doilies, the doilies as premium shortbread assortment, and the Grimsdyke voucher as one scented pillar candle, lavender. More curious than the switches themselves was the precision. This was not random scribbling. It had been done carefully, methodically, each alteration made in a tidy, looping hand. Who had access to this list before the error was found? Perbrite asked. Mrs. Purwin straightened with affronted dignity. No one but myself, the committee, and well those who wandered near the table. But I can assure you that I didn't miswrite anything. Mrs. Hardstyle, who had materialized behind her, sniffed. We should consider incompetence before sabotage, Purwin. Mrs. Purwin stiffened. My competence is not up for investigation. Perbrite intervened with a light clearing of the throat. Ladies, if I may. When was this discovered? Mrs. Purwin drew herself up. 10 minutes after you left. I stepped away to fetch a pen. When I returned, the descriptions were altered. Mally scribbled notes. Anyone lingering nearby? Mrs. Wymington, Purwin said quickly, but she claimed she was only adjusting the placement of the knitted pot covers. Wymington, hearing her name, glided toward them with the confidence of someone equal parts offended and curious. I moved the pot covers because they were bunched together like mushrooms in a damp field, but I did not touch the prize list. Of course you would deny it, Purwin muttered. Wymington's lips tightened. Much as you deny misplacing simple items, Purwin. The two exchanged expressions that could curdle cream. Perbrite observed them both, quietly noting the shifting frictions. Sabotage of Cupcakes, and now a raffle list minor acts, almost comical in isolation, yet clearly intended to provoke embarrassment, not harm. Someone wanted the structure of the event to wobble just enough for reputations to tremble. He asked gently, Mrs. Purwin, was the altered handwriting familiar to you? She hesitated. It could resemble Mrs. Hardstyle's, in a certain light. Mrs. Hardstyle inhaled sharply. My handwriting is immaculate. I do not produce these looping, childish curves, and I have nothing to gain by causing chaos at my own bake sale. It was true enough. Too true, perhaps. But Perbrite never dismissed truths spoken too emphatically. He handed the clipboard to Mally for closer examination before returning his attention to the tables. Sergeant, would you kindly check whether any additional items appear disturbed? Gently, please. Disorder thrives when given encouragement. As Mally moved off, Perbrite turned inward for a moment. 2 acts of tampering within the span of an hour. Both require proximity, opportunity, and a willingness to stir social discomfort. Sabotage that relied not on malice but on subtle ridicule. Someone was making mischief with intention. He made a slow circuit of the hall, engaging a few attendees in mild conversation. Most had little to offer beyond conjecture, though the conjectures themselves were revealing. Several people mentioned tensions between committee members, particularly a quiet dispute over who would chair next year's event. Others spoke of Eunice Lavender's cupcakes with newfound dramatic flair, as if the act of sabotage had elevated them to near mythical significance. Then, just as Perbrite approached the window, he saw a flash of movement outside the hurried departure of Harold Lavender, Eunice's cousin, with his coat slung over one shoulder and his gait noticeably brisk. Perbrite considered this. Harold had been mentioned earlier, but only in relation to the sugar jar. His sudden flight now, while suspicious in timing, did not yet signal guilt, but it warranted a conversation. He stepped back to Mally. Sergeant, would you be so good as to fetch Mr. Harold Lavender? He appears to be leaving with unexpected haste. Mally peered out. On it, sir. While the sergeant jogged after Harold, Perbrite remained in the hall, listening to the small theatres of conversation around him. It was remarkable how rapidly a community adapted its tone when fear of embarrassment entered the room. Some attendees now discussed the tampering with hushed solemnity, as though the very act of speaking too loudly might implicate them. Within 5 minutes, Mally returned with a slightly breathless Harold in tow, a young man with a friendly but perpetually uneasy expression. Harold looked as if he regretted every decision that had led him into adulthood. "Inspector," he began before Perbrite could speak, "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just leaving because, well, I promised to help set up the church lawn game stands this afternoon." Perbrite nodded mildly. "Of course. And yet I wonder if we might clarify a few matters before you go. You borrowed a jar of sugar from your cousin recently." Harold flushed. "Yes. For the lemonade. I returned it. Honestly, I thought it was sugar. Did you use citric crystals in your lemonade preparations?" "Yes, but those are mine. I keep them in my kitchen. I didn't bring them here." Perbrite examined him with gentle scrutiny. Harold was many things, but deceitful did not appear to be one of them. He was, however, exactly the sort to be used unknowingly by someone more cunning. "And this morning," Perbrite continued, "were you near the raffle table?" Harold blinked. "No, sir. I only came to buy a slice of cake." But then everyone looked cross, so I thought it best to go. Mally folded his arms. "You didn't speak to anyone? Didn't handle anything on the tables?" "No, I didn't touch a thing." Perbrite believed him, or believed at least that Harold believed himself innocent of involvement. He sent the young man off, then lowered his voice to Mally. "Sergeant, the person responsible is not Harold, but they are someone comfortable mingling here, someone petty, patient, and familiar with the workings of this event." Mally glanced across the hall, "which describes half the committee." "Precisely," Perbrite murmured. Before he could say more, Mrs. Hardstyle approached, voice trembling in outraged indignation. "Inspector, something else has occurred. The decorative centerpiece of the cake stand has gone missing." "Missing?" Perbrite repeated, though not surprised. "Yes, gone. Removed entirely, and no one will admit to touching it." Perbrite took a calm breath. The pieces were aligning slowly but unmistakably. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "it appears our culprit is escalating." And then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "This is becoming rather interesting. The announcement of the missing cake stand spread across the parish hall with the immediacy of a minor earthquake, though one conducted entirely in whispers, stiff shoulders, and indignant glances. Mrs. Hardstyle's expression had become a study in outraged martyrdom, as though the universe had singled her out for trials of a peculiarly domestic nature. Perbrite regarded her with his usual calm, though his eyes narrowed just slightly, not in accusation, but in recognition that the situation had now moved distinctly beyond harmless meddling. "Where was the cake stand last seen?" he asked. Mrs. Hardstyle pressed a hand to her chest, as though steadying her composure. "On the center table, of course. It is the very same stand we use each year, polished silver. 3 tiers. Everyone knows its place." "And who had access to that table?" Perbrite asked, though he already suspected the answer would be vague and unhelpful. "Everyone," Mrs. Hardstyle replied, throwing her hands up. "People wander, Inspector. They mill, they examine, they poke, they rearrange things without permission. Half the attendees believe themselves qualified interior decorators." This, Perbrite supposed, was true enough. The flow of people in the hall had been constant all morning. Still, the removal of a rather noticeable object suggested more than the idle misplacement of well-meaning volunteers. Sergeant Mally reappeared from his inspection of the tables, shaking his head. "No sign of the stand, sir. Someone's taken it right out of the hall." Mrs. Wymington, who had been lingering with a look of suspiciously triumphant curiosity, stepped forward. "Inspector, if someone has taken that stand, they will have left the hall by the side door. It sticks terribly, so you have to lift it slightly. Anyone who managed it would have made a show of effort." This was confirmed by two other members of the society, who demonstrated the obstinate nature of the door by attempting to open it, failing, and glaring at one another as if the blame belonged to the other's less helpful commentary. Perbrite examined the door himself. The stickiness was genuine, though not insurmountable. Someone determined and strong enough could have lifted the door with a discreet push of the shoulder. Sergeant Purbright said, "Check outside. The stand may have been discarded nearby." Mally went off at once, leaving Perbrite with the committee women, who continued to debate motives in increasingly dramatic tones. He let their conversations wash over him, accusations suggesting envy, spite, misconceptions over past events, and one reference to a feud stemming from a disagreement about napkin colors the previous winter. These overlapping suspicions formed a familiar tapestry of Flaxborough life, but amid them Perbrite detected a common thread. The tampering incidents had targeted multiple areas of the bake sale, each one reflecting on a different member of the committee. Eunice Lavender humiliated by crooked cupcakes, Perwin embarrassed by the prize list, Hardstyle undermined by the missing stand. A chain of petty disruptions, each directed at a different woman in a group that already contained simmering tensions. Someone was not simply sabotaging the event, they were carefully sowing discord within the society. He was interrupted by Mally's return. The sergeant carried the missing cake stand under one arm, looking both perplexed and mildly sheepish. "Found it, sir," Mrs. Hardstyle gasped, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. "Where?" Mally hesitated. "In the churchyard, behind a gravestone." A collective murmur rippled across the hall. Perbrite reached forward and inspected the cake stand. A faint smudge of something white clung to one tier. "Icing sugar," he murmured. Mrs. Hardstyle clutched her pearls. "They desecrated the churchyard with sugar?" "No," Perbrite replied gently. "But someone evidently handled the stand after touching the cakes." Mrs. Wymington leaned in, "Which suggests perhaps our saboteur has a sweet tooth." Mally ignored her commentary. "There's more, sir." This was left beside it. He produced a folded scrap of paper. Perbrite unfolded it. Inside, written in the same tidy looping hand as the altered raffle list, was a simple phrase: "Next time, pay attention." The committee erupted in agitated astonishment. Mrs. Perwin declared it a threat. Mrs. Hardstyle called it insolent. Mrs. Broxholm muttered darkly about young people today, despite the handwriting appearing far more deliberate than youthful. Perbrite studied the note. No signature, no identifying marks, just the looping script and the curious admonition. The saboteur was not merely provoking random chaos. They were issuing instructions, or perhaps warnings, to a specific audience. Sergeant Purbright said quietly, "Do you recall whether anyone handled the raffle list before we examined it?" Mally nodded. "Only the committee members, as far as I could see. But the hall was busy. Anyone could have leaned over it while Mrs. Perwin chatted." "Indeed." Perbright folded the note carefully. "And the cake stands something large, difficult to remove without being seen." He looked around the hall. The faces of the attendees bore expressions ranging from eager interest to wounded righteousness. Yet one characteristic unified them. Each person considered themselves fundamentally innocent and entirely above suspicion. This, Perbrite had long learned, was the surest indicator that someone was lying. He cleared his throat gently. "Ladies and gentlemen, might I ask, who was responsible for arranging the center table this morning?" A brief silence followed. Then Mrs. Hardstyle lifted her chin. "I was. Naturally. It is one of the duties of the chair." "And was anyone assisting you?" Another pause, shorter but more pointed. Mrs. Wymington shifted. "I may have offered suggestions." Mrs. Broxholm sniffed. "You rearranged everything she did." "That is a lie," Wymington replied smoothly. "I simply corrected the spacing. A centerpiece must draw the eye, not repel it." Their bickering intensified. Perbrite listened, not for the volume of voices, but for what remained unsaid. It was clear that beneath the veneer of cooperative charity work simmered rivalries old enough to seem like traditions, and someone had chosen today to exploit them. Mally leaned toward him. "Sir, shall we question them individually?" "In due time," Perbrite replied quietly. "But first, we observe." As they watched, a small commotion arose at the tea table. Mrs. Purwin had discovered that the labels on the jars of loose-leaf tea had been swapped, leading one unfortunate gentleman to pour a spoonful of Assam into his cup expecting Darjeeling. The man, affronted but polite, insisted on replacing the entire cup, much to Purwin's mortification. More tampering, subtle, disruptive, and deeply annoying. Perbrite exhaled slowly. The pattern was now undeniable. Someone was conducting a campaign not against the bake sale itself, but against the pride and competence of its organizers. He turned to Mally. "Sergeant, our culprit is not merely mischievous. They are methodical, and they are escalating. We must act before the next incident causes more than embarrassment." Mally nodded. "What's our next step, sir?" Perbrite surveyed the hall once more. "We identify who benefits most from these disruptions. Not in reputation, but in satisfaction." He paused as his eye caught Eunice Lavender again, still shrinking into her chair, still guilty of nothing except being an easy target. "And we consider who might wish to see the committee humbled." Mally frowned. "A rival group. Or," Perbrite said softly, "a rival individual." The hall's atmosphere had shifted from festive anticipation to a sort of brittle vigilance. People no longer drifted casually between tables. They moved with the self-conscious stiffness of individuals aware they might be observed or suspected. Every rearranged napkin, every misplaced spoon, every oddly tilted jam tart now seemed ripe for scrutiny. Perbrite watched the change with quiet interest. Guilt, even when misplaced, produced remarkable behavioral adjustments. He strolled back toward the center table, hands loosely clasped behind his back. The cake stand, now recovered and polished hastily by Mrs. Hardstyle, had been returned to its rightful place, though Hardstyle herself maintained a perimeter around it as though warding off invisible threats. She straightened each plate and doily with almost ceremonial precision, her motions betraying an anxiety she refused to admit aloud. Perbrite offered her a mild, reassuring nod. "Restoring order, Mrs. Hardstyle?" She sniffed, attempting to. "Though the committee appears to be surrounded by saboteurs, vandals, and a general decline in moral discipline." Perbrite considered the whole. Nothing so grand as moral decline was at play, merely a smaller, more localized form of mischief. And yet the nature of the acts suggested more than idle troublemaking. They were targeted, delicate, crafted to embarrass certain individuals rather than disrupt the event as a whole. He moved toward the refreshments table, where Mrs. Purwin was reorganizing the mislabeled tea jars with the look of someone betrayed by the world's very foundations. She lifted a jar of Assam, inspected the label, and replaced it with a decisive huff. "Inspector," she said without looking up, "do you know what this means? Someone here has too much time, too little respect, and altogether too much audacity." Or, Perbrite replied gently, "they have something they wish to express, but feel unable to do so directly." Purwin paused mid-adjustment. "Express? Through tea?" Perbrite gave a small, almost sympathetic smile. People choose curious methods to reveal their grievances. Before Purwin could respond, a short, sharp exclamation came from the far corner of the hall. Mrs. Broxholm stood beside the donation box, her eyes wide with theatrical dismay. "Inspector Purbright," she cried. "The money and the donations, they're all in the wrong order." Perbrite approached at his usual unhurried pace, Mally right behind him. Broxholm pointed at the open donation box. The bills inside were not missing, merely arranged by denomination, alternating in a precise pattern. £1, £2, £1, £2. It was meaningless but meticulous. Mally frowned. Who sorts donations like that? Broxholm whispered dramatically, a criminal mastermind. Perbrite doubted that mastermind status could be bestowed on someone who tampered with icing, labels, and small change, but the compulsive neatness did narrow the psychological profile. This saboteur liked an order of their own making, imposed subtly but unmistakably. It was not vandalism. It was authorship. He looked up. Has anyone touched the donation box today? Mrs. Broxholm bristled. I check it regularly. I would certainly have noticed if someone rummaged in it. Unless, Wymington interjected smoothly, the rummaging occurred while you were gossiping by the tea table. Broxholm turned scarlet. I was gathering information. Perbrite let the argument pass. He focused instead on the donation box's placement. Not hidden, not central, but somewhat tucked aside, easy to access unnoticed by someone who blended into the hall's rhythm. He murmured to Mally. Our saboteur moves freely but carefully. They prefer small alterations to nothing destructive. Why not just cause real trouble? Mally asked. Because that is not the point, Perbrite said quietly. They wish to unsettle, not ruin. He scanned the hall. The committee women were loudly debating whose responsibility it had been to check the donation box. A few attendees had gathered near the entrance, debating theories of increasing absurdity. Eunice Lavender still sat alone, shrinking further into herself as every new disruption seemed to implicate her by proximity. Perbrite made his way over to her. Mrs. Lavender, how are you managing? She was startled at being addressed. I'm trying not to faint, Inspector. This entire morning feels like a nightmare stitched together with ribbons and sponge. Have you noticed anything unusual? Anything at all? Eunice pondered this, chewing her lip. Well, there was something, though it's silly. When I arrived this morning, I saw Mrs. Pomemeroy leaving the hall. She isn't part of the bake sale. I thought she'd only come to peek in, but she looked quite cross, and she was holding a small paper bag. Perbrite's interest sharpened. Mrs. Pomemeroy. Cross, you say? Oh, yes. She looked as though she'd swallowed a lemon. Mally scribbled furiously. Why would Mrs. Pomemeroy here? Eunice hesitated. Well, she applied for a place on the committee this year. Mrs. Hardstyle rejected her application. Something about poor organizational skills. Perbrite understood now. A denied position, a slight real or perceived, and a woman known for her tidy handwriting and obsessive love of symmetry. Mrs. Pomeroy had once been seen rearranging hymnals in church because they looked untidy. She also had a reputation for writing firmly worded letters to local shops about the correct placement of tinned goods. Perbrite found these details assembling themselves quietly into a coherent shape. He rose. Sergeant, Mrs. Pomeroy's address? Mally checked his notebook. Rosemary Lane, sir. I live alone. Keeps cats. Complained last month about the town notice board being a disgrace to standards. Perbrite nodded. Indeed. Let us pay her a visit. As they approached the hall entrance, Mrs. Hardstyle intercepted them. Inspector, you're leaving. At a time like this? Perbrite gave her a polite bow of the head, only to follow a small thread which may lead somewhere useful. And what are we to do in the meantime? She demanded. Remain vigilant, he said, though he suspected this instruction would be energetically exceeded. Outside, the air had cooled slightly, and a breeze skimmed across the churchyard where the cake stand had been found. Perbrite paused before stepping onto the path leading to Rosemary Lane. Sir, Mally asked, do you think she's really the one behind it all? Perbrite allowed himself a small, thoughtful exhale. "I think," he said calmly, "that Mrs. Pomeroy is very much worth talking to, and that the smallest grievances often lead to the most carefully orchestrated mischief." With that, they set off toward Rosemary Lane, each step moving them closer to the mind behind the crooked cupcakes and every petty disruption that had followed. The walk to Rosemary Lane was brisk, the crisp morning light sharpening the outlines of the quiet houses along the way. Flaxborough, at this hour, carried the deceptive tranquility of a town that preferred its dramas small, internal, and thoroughly domestic. Yet beneath its tidy surfaces lay all the simmering resentments and social ambitions that gave Inspector Purbright's working life its peculiar character. Mrs. Pomeroy's cottage stood prim and self-contained, framed by two precisely trimmed hedges that converged like bookends. Even the paving stones leading to her front door seemed to have been arranged with geometric precision. Perbrite paused before knocking, taking in the immaculate symmetry of the garden, the sort of place where a single crooked flower pot might have constituted emotional upheaval. He knocked gently. A rustle sounded inside, followed by a cautious shuffle. The door opened just wide enough to reveal Mrs. Pomeroy's narrow face peering out, her spectacles perched precariously on her nose. "Inspector Purbright," she said, her voice tight, "and Sergeant Malley. To what do I owe this visit?" Perbrite smiled in his mild, courteous way. "A few questions, Mrs. Pomeroy, regarding the bake sale this morning. May we come in?" She hesitated just long enough to confirm her reluctance before stepping back to allow them inside. The hallway was as immaculate as the garden. Not a paper out of place, not a speck of dust daring to defy the order she maintained. "Do take a seat," she said stiffly, motioning toward a sofa so rigid it looked upholstered in self-discipline. "I suppose this is about the commotion at the hall?" Perbrite sat, noticing the symmetrical arrangement of cushions. "Yes. You were seen leaving the hall rather early today." Mrs. Pomeroy's lips tightened. "I stepped in briefly. I wished to see how the preparations were going. I have an interest in community events." "Of course," Perbrite said. "And yet you left looking quite upset." She bristled. "Upset? Hardly. I was merely disappointed. I had offered my help, but Mrs. Hardstyle insisted everything was under control, as usual." Malley cleared his throat. "Is it true you wish to join the committee this year?" Mrs. Pomeroy folded her hands crisply in her lap. "I applied, yes, and Mrs. Hardstyle rejected my application on the grounds that the committee was already full. A convenient excuse, I might add." Perbrite nodded slowly. "And this disappointment, did it leave you feeling excluded?" Mrs. Pomeroy let out a brittle laugh. "Inspector, I'm accustomed to being overlooked in this town. One grows used to other people's poor judgment." Perbrite's gaze drifted to a small writing desk positioned beneath the window. The papers on its surface were arranged with fastidious care. In the center lay a pad of stationery, and beside it a pen whose nib gleamed with fresh ink. A small jar labeled citric cleaning crystals stood nearby. "I see you keep citric crystals," Perbrite remarked gently. "For cleaning kettles," she replied sharply. "Is that a crime?" "Not at all," Perbrite said. "But it does remind me of something found in the parish hall earlier." Mrs. Pomeroy's expression flickered barely, but enough for a trained observer. She adjusted her spectacles. "I suppose someone made a mess of things. Flaxborough's standards have fallen dreadfully." "Indeed," Perbrite murmured. "Several small disturbances occurred today. Cupcake sabotage, raffle list alterations, a missing cake stand, tea labels swapped. Even the donation box was rearranged, all executed with careful attention." Mrs. Pomeroy's posture stiffened even more. Children, perhaps, or disorganized adults. The hall was full of them. Perbrite leaned forward slightly, the handwriting on the altered prize list neat loops, meticulous curves. "Very similar to that on your address labels." Mrs. Pomemeroy. Mally winced inwardly at the directness, but Perbrite's tone remained perfectly mild. Mrs. Pomemeroy blinked slowly. "Are you accusing me of vandalizing a charity bake sale?" Perbrite shook his head. "Not vandalizing. Correcting. Or rather, attempting to highlight what you perceive as inadequacies." Her mouth opened, but no denial emerged. Perbrite continued softly. "Your grievance with the committee appears long-standing. Small slights can breed considerable frustration, and your desire to demonstrate their incompetence, even subtly, would be understandable." Mrs. Pomeroy's jaw tightened. Understandable, perhaps, but untrue. Perbrite allowed a long silence to settle. In that silence hung the faint sound of a ticking clock, the distant murmur of birds, and the weight of unspoken truths. "Mrs. Pomeroy," he said finally, "you left the hall at 9 o'clock carrying a small paper bag. What was in it?" "A few lemon drops," she answered too quickly. "For my nerves." "Not your citric crystals?" Perbrite asked gently. Her hands twitched. "I did have some with me. I intended to return them to Mrs. Hardstyle. She borrowed them once." Mally raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Hardstyle borrowing cleaning crystals? Can't picture it." "I don't care what you picture," she snapped, her composure cracking. "I was trying to help, to show them how things could be done properly." Perbrite nodded, as though this were the first entirely reasonable thing she had said. "You wish to assist the committee?" "Yes," she burst out, the veneer of restraint slipping. "But they didn't want me. They never want me. They run their events with all the elegance of a muddled pantry, and then they dismiss me because I care too much." The outpouring left her breathing unevenly. Perbrite spoke with the gentleness of a man familiar with the wounds pride could leave behind. "Mrs. Pomeroy, the disruptions today may not have caused physical harm, but they created genuine distress. These acts are small, though they carry consequences, especially for those already feeling the strain of public scrutiny." She looked away, her voice shrinking to a whisper. "I only meant to make a point." "And you have," Perbrite said kindly. "But the point has now grown larger than intended. Will you come to the station with us so we may clarify matters formally?" She flinched, but did not refuse. "If I must." "It would be best," Perbrite replied. As they escorted her to the door, she paused to straighten a slightly misaligned stack of magazines on the table. Even with her confession hovering, she could not resist correcting a flaw. Outside, Mally exhaled. "Well, sir, it seems we've got her." Perbrite looked thoughtfully at the cottage. "Perhaps, but I doubt the full truth is quite so tidy. Mrs. Pomeroy's hand is in these disturbances, but intention does not always align with outcome. There is more yet to understand." Mally stared. "You think someone else is involved?" Perbrite nodded. "Not involved, Sergeant, but affected, and those affected often reveal the most." With Mrs. Pomeroy in tow, they began the walk back toward the station, aware that the tidy facade of Flaxborough was, as always, far more complicated than it appeared. The walk back toward town unfolded with a quiet tension clinging to the edges of thought. Mrs. Pomeroy kept her hands clasped tightly before her, as though warding off further accusations. She walked briskly, chin lifted, but the trembling at the corner of her mouth betrayed the strain beneath the posture. Perbrite, whose gaze seldom missed to such details, considered her carefully not as a culprit alone, but as a woman whose frustrations had finally overflowed into public mischief. Yet something in her outburst at the cottage lingered with him. Her acts bore precision, irritation, and repressed resentment, but not malice. And while the disruptions at the bake sale had been irritating, they had lacked cruelty. He could almost believe her motives, though self-serving, had not extended beyond wanting the committee to see their shortcomings. Almost. They were halfway across the churchyard when a breathless figure approached them. Eunice Lavender hurried up the path, clutching her handbag and looking as if she'd run the entire distance from the parish hall. "Inspector Purbright," she called, her voice quavering. "Please, please, you must come back at once. There's been another incident." Perbrite slowed, exchanging a brief glance with Mally before turning to Eunice. "What has happened now?" "It's Mrs. Wymington," Eunice gasped. "She's well, the frosting on her Victoria sponge has been rearranged." Mally blinked. "Rearranged?" "Yes. Into a word. A single word." Eunice lowered her voice, though the churchyard was empty. "It spells enough." Perbrite felt a quiet shift of interest. This was not Mrs. Pomemeroy's style. The earlier acts had been subtle, petty, precise, and easily mistaken for oversight. But frosting messages were overt, dramatic, meant to draw attention rather than quietly embarrass. Mrs. Pomemeroy stiffened. "I would never write in frosting." "It's vulgar." Perbrite nodded. "No, I believe you. But who?" Eunice looked between them helplessly. "That is what we must determine," Perbrite said. "Sergeant, escort Mrs. Pomemeroy to the station. I will join you shortly." Mrs. Pomemeroy bristled. "You cannot think someone else is involved." "I think," Perbrite replied gently, "that your actions opened a door which another has since stepped through." He watched Mally lead her toward the high street before turning back with Eunice. "Now, Mrs. Lavender, take me through everything that has occurred since we left." As they approached the hall, Eunice spoke in hurried fragments. The committee's tempers had frayed past polite limits. Mrs. Hardstyle had accused Mrs. Wymington of lax supervision. Mrs. Brock's home had suggested the saboteur must be someone with artistic flair, but no moral compass. Mrs. Purwin had contributed loudly to every accusation, each remark adding unnecessary gasoline to an already smouldering fire. And amid that escalating chaos, someone had altered Wymington's celebrated Victoria sponge, sliding the frosting with deliberate strokes to spell out a quiet but unmistakable message. Enough. Perbrite entered the hall. The tension inside had curdled into something heavier. People stood in tight clusters, speaking in hushed but heated tones. Mrs. Wymington held the cake aloft as though it were both evidence and personal insult. "There," she snapped, thrusting it toward Perbrite. "You see, this is targeted harassment." He inspected the cake. The word was rendered in smooth, neat lines as though done with care. Whoever had written it had a steady hand. "Where was this cake kept?" he asked. "On the cooling table," Mrs. Wymington replied, untouched. "Or so I believed." Mrs. Hardstyle interjected. "We all believed many things today. Most of them are wrong." Perbrite ignored the commentary. "Who was nearest the table when you discovered the alteration?" Wymington gestured, dramatically. Mrs. Brock's home was closest. Brock's home blinked in indignation. "I was tying a ribbon around the donation jar. I have no interest in vandalizing cakes." Purwin sniffed. "You have plenty of interest in undermining people, though." "This from a woman who alphabetizes her spice rack," Brock's home retorted. As they quarreled, Perbrite walked slowly around the table, examining the sponge from several angles before gently lifting it to check beneath. No fingerprints would reveal themselves easily in frosting, and he had no expectation they would. Instead, he focused on the positioning. The frosting strokes ran evenly across the top, done quickly but with confidence. He asked, "Mrs. Lavender, who discovered the message?" "Oh, well, I did," Eunice admitted. "I went to fetch a slice to bring to Mrs. Pomemeroy before I found she had left and noticed the word. Was anyone else near the sponge before that moment?" A ripple of uncertain murmurs spread. No one wanted to answer first. Finally, Mrs. Hardstyle said, "I saw Mrs. Purwin hovering near the table. She was muttering about presentation and standards." Mrs. Purwin, affronted, said, "I hover near everything. One must supervise when order is collapsing." Perbrite regarded her. Mrs. Purwin, did you touch the cake? I most certainly did not. I have no reason to deface Wymington's sponge, however dry it may be. Wymington bristled. Dry? Dry! My sponge has won awards? Broxholm snorted. From who? People with broken taste buds? The hall dissolved again into bickering. Perbrite let their quarrels swirl around him like dust clouds until a small detail aligned quietly in his mind. Mrs. Pomemeroy had left early. Mrs. Purwin had been outspoken but not stealthy. The committee members' movements were too visible, their animosities too loud. But Lavender Eunice, who had been pushed, sidelined, pitied. Eunice, whose cupcakes had been sabotaged and who now stood trembling slightly as if overwhelmed. Perbrite stepped toward her. Mrs. Lavender, when you discovered the frosting message, did you see anyone leaving the table? Eunice hesitated. No, I don't think so. Her answer was slow. Too slow. Perbrite nodded gently. It must have been quite a shock. Eunice flinched. Oh yes, terrible. He smiled, soft and steady. Mrs. Lavender, might we have a quiet word outside? The room froze. Eunice's eyes widened, panic flickering behind them. Is that necessary? She whispered. Only a word, Perbrite said kindly. He led her toward the doorway, her steps faltering as though each one carried the weight of confession. Outside, the air felt cold against the tension radiating from her. Perbrite turned to her with unhurried patience. Mrs. Lavender, some of the disruptions today were not Mrs. Pomeroy's doing. They bear a different hand. Softer strokes, hesitant but deliberate. Eunice swallowed. Inspector, I don't know you were humiliated this morning, Perbrite said gently, and the committee has not always treated you kindly. That is understandable, but writing enough on Mrs. Wymington's sponge expression feels personal. Tears glimmered at her lashes. I didn't know how else to make them see, she whispered. And did you also sort the donations? Perbrite asked softly. A single tear escaped. I only meant to help. They said I was careless last year. What about swapping the tea labels? Mrs. Purwin always criticizes my serving table. And the cupcakes. Her breath hitched, guilt stamping itself across her features. I found Mrs. Pomeroy's crystals, Eunice whispered. I thought perhaps if they believed someone was sabotaging everything, they'd stop blaming me, or notice me, or just leave me alone. Perbrite sighed, though not unkindly. Two saboteurs, each driven by wounded pride, but one quiet, invisible, aching for acknowledgement. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Mrs. Lavender, everything will be handled properly. But the truth must now come inside with us. Eunice nodded weakly, and together they prepared to re-enter the hall where the tangled web of resentments had at last revealed its fullest shape. When Perbrite re-entered the parish hall with Eunice beside him, the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Conversations faltered. Accusations halted mid-syllable. The committee's quarrels, previously so robust, shrank into uneasy murmurs. Eunice's lowered head, her trembling hands, and the inspector's calm, guiding presence were enough to signal that something significant, something delicate was about to unfold. Perbrite paused just inside the doorway, letting the silence settle. Flaxborough citizens, for all their fondness for gossip, possessed a deep aversion to drama occurring in their immediate presence. The stillness that filled the hall reflected this discomfort. He guided Eunice toward a vacant table near the front, away from the larger clusters of spectators. She sat cautiously, as though afraid the chair itself might pass judgment. Perbrite stood beside her, hands lightly clasped before him, his expression serene but attentive. Ladies and gentlemen, he began in his measured tone. Some clarity has emerged regarding the disruptions that have occurred today. Immediately, an anxious rustling started among the committee members. Mrs. Hardstyle stepped forward, chin rigid with expectation. Inspector, I sincerely hope this matter is resolved quickly. The Society's reputation has suffered enough embarrassment for one morning." Perbrite inclined his head. "Indeed. And much of that embarrassment has stemmed not from malice, but misunderstanding, though misunderstanding followed by poor decisions." A wave of puzzled frowns trickled across the hall. Mrs. Wilmington folded her arms. Mrs. Purwin attempted to stand taller. Mrs. Broxholm clutched her handbag as though bracing for turbulence. Perbrite continued, his voice gentle. Mrs. Pomemeroy played a part in today's disturbances. Her frustrations with the committee led her to make subtle corrections or disruptions aimed at drawing attention to perceived disorganization. She has acknowledged as much. Gasps rose, followed by a chorus of tutting. Someone muttered something about moral decay, another about standards falling across the county. Yet Perbrite noted the faint satisfaction in some expressions, private vindications, old rivalries surfacing with polite restraint. Before the crowd could fully ignite, Perbrite lifted a hand, restoring quiet. But Mrs. Pomeroy was not responsible for all that occurred. Now the rustling grew sharper, the unease more palpable. Even Mally, who had rejoined the gathering, straightened slightly. Perbrite turned to Eunice, who looked as though she might dissolve under the weight of their attention. "Mrs. Lavender," he said softly, "has something she wishes to say." Eunice flinched but nodded. Her voice emerged thin, trembling but honest. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I truly didn't. Only everything this morning went wrong, and people were looking at me as if it were my fault. And last year they said I wasn't careful, and Mrs. Purwin called my table arrangements chaotic." Her breath wavered. "I thought perhaps if there were more mistakes, they would stop thinking everything was my doing." A stunned silence followed her admission. Mrs. Hardstyle blinked. "You? But you're so quiet." "I was tired of being quiet," Eunice whispered. Perbrite stepped in gently. Mrs. Lavender added the citric crystals to her own cupcakes after discovering Mrs. Pomeroy's jar in the supply box. She rearranged the labels on the tea jars. She sorted the donations, and she wrote on Mrs. Wilmington's sponge. Mrs. Wilmington, affronted but also theatrically intrigued, pressed a hand to her chest. "My sponge." "Yes," Eunice squeaked, "but only because, well, you said at the last meeting that some people simply lacked natural baking discipline. And you looked at me when you said it." Wilmington reddened. "I look everywhere when I speak." Broxholm muttered, "Not today, you didn't." Perbrite continued with calm precision. Mrs. Lavender's intent was not to sabotage the event entirely, but to redirect blame she felt settling unfairly upon her. Meanwhile, Mrs. Pomeroy independently created her own disruptions earlier in the morning, motivated by exclusion from the committee. The group absorbed this, the layers of mischief unraveled into a quiet web of grievances long ignored. Mrs. Purwin sniffed loudly. "I blame the committee's decision-making. None of this would have happened if we appointed people based on competence instead of politics." "Are you implying something?" Wilmington snapped. "Everything," Purwin retorted. Mrs. Hardstyle tried to intervene, attempting authority cracking under the morning strain. "Ladies, please, this is hardly the time." "Oh, I believe it is precisely the time," Broxholm interjected. "We've been dancing around resentments for years." Eunice shrank under the escalating tension. Perbrite raised a hand once more. "Perhaps," he said mildly, "a more productive approach would be to acknowledge the pressures each of you has faced. Flaxborough's events rely heavily on volunteers who, like anyone, desire recognition, fairness, and the occasional kind word." It was a remarkably diplomatic observation. The committee members, though puffed with defensiveness moments before, found themselves softening under his steady tone. Eunice dabbed her eyes. "I only wanted to feel part of the society. I never wanted to ruin it." Mrs. Hardstyle exhaled deeply, more slowly, more thoughtfully than usual. Eunice, perhaps we have been rather brisk with you, and perhaps briskness is not the optimal tone for fostering confidence. Eunice sniffled. Does that mean? It means, Hardstyle said stiffly, that things may need re-evaluation. Broxholm folded her arms. Re-evaluating indeed, starting with communication. Wymington nodded. And expectations, Perwin added, and leadership. Hardstyle shot her a look. Not too much re-evaluating. Despite the tension, a ripple of subdued amusement crossed several faces. Perbrite allowed the moment to breathe before speaking again. Mrs. Lavender's actions were misguided but not malicious. As for Mrs. Pomemeroy, her contributions, though also unwise, stemmed from exclusion rather than spite. Both situations warrant proper handling, but neither requires alarm. Mally stepped forward. We'll take statements, of course, but I don't imagine formal charges will be necessary unless further mischief arises. Mrs. Pomeroy, standing near the entrance now with Mally's supervision, lifted her chin. I may have let my feelings get the better of me. Eunice whispered, Me too. Perbrite nodded kindly. Most troubles in Flaxborough arise when feelings have nowhere to go but sideways. A soft murmur of agreement traveled the hall. Gradually, a fragile but genuine calm began to settle. The crowd dispersed into smaller groups not to gossip maliciously, but to examine the day's missteps with something closer to introspection. And while bitterness still lingered at the edges, it was softened now by understanding and, in some cases, reluctant sympathy. Perbrite stepped aside, letting the hall resume its rhythm. Mally approached him quietly. Sir, he said, it seems we're nearly through this business. Perbrite looked out across the room where the committee members were now speaking with something resembling civility. Nearly, Sergeant, he said softly. But clarity is not the same as closure. Before this day concludes, we must ensure all threads are tied properly. Mally nodded. What's next, then? We gathered the final pieces, Perbrite replied. And then we explain. The parish hall gradually settled into a tense but manageable hum. A few of the more pragmatic attendees resumed tidying, straightening clothes and reorganizing the tables with a determination that suggested the day could yet be salvaged. Others lingered only for the satisfaction of witnessing the aftermath, exchanging subdued commentary in the manner of theater critics evaluating a chaotic dress rehearsal. Eunice Lavender remained near the doorway where Perbrite had left her, sitting small and pale, hands clasped tightly as though still apologizing with her posture. Mrs. Hardstyle, to her credit, had stepped aside to speak with her in private. Her usually severe tone softened, though not entirely softened, by a newly discovered sense of responsibility. Perbrite, meanwhile, took a slow circuit of the hall. He observed without interrupting, noting how the committee members had turned inward, not in hostility now, but in contemplation. Mrs. Wymington hovered over her sponge cake, examining the incriminating frosting strokes with a fascination bordering on academic. Mrs. Perwin had taken to rearranging the tea jars again, muttering about order. Mrs. Broxholm remained entrenched in her customary skepticism, though she had even lowered her guard enough to offer Eunice a gentle nod. Mally approached with the clipboard that held earlier notes from the morning's disruptions. Sir, I think we understand the full picture now. 2 culprits, separate motives, a heap of miscommunication feels tidy enough. Perbrite's eyes lingered on the chalkboard listing bake sale totals. A number had been partially erased, leaving a faint dusting of white smudges beneath it. It was a small detail minor, but not without meaning. Tidy on the surface, Sergeant, he murmured. But surfaces are rarely the entire story. Mally frowned. Do you think something's missing? Perbrite tilted his head slightly. Not missing. Overlooked. Mally followed his gaze to the smudged chalkboard. You think someone altered that too? Perhaps. Or perhaps someone attempted to correct it. Either way, it suggests one more hand at work today. Mally blinked. Another saboteur. Purbright smiled faintly. A saboteur does not always succeed, and a near miss can reveal as much as a completed act. He turned from the chalkboard and approached the donation box once more. The alternating banknotes sat exactly as before, but something about their arrangement, too deliberate and neat, felt distinct from Eunice's hesitant, emotionally driven meddling. And Mrs. Pomeroy's precision, though present elsewhere, had not touched the frosting nor the donation pattern Eunice had claimed. 2 women had confessed, yes, but the total number of disruptions exceeded the combined patterns of their behavior. He gestured toward the center table. "Sergeant, do you recall who stood nearest the stand after its return?" Mally tapped his temple. Mrs. Hardstyle guarded it like treasure. Perbrite nodded. Indeed. Before she did, however, someone straightened the lower tier. I saw it shift slightly. Mally frowned. And that tells us that someone besides our 2 culprits has been hovering, someone whose involvement has so far gone, unquestioned because her authority placed her above suspicion. Mally blinked. You don't mean... Consider, Sergeant Purbright said gently, who benefits from minor chaos, if not the person eager to demonstrate control in restoring order? A soft dawning crept across Mally's face. Mrs. Hardstyle? Perbrite inclined his head thoughtfully. Her committee has been fracturing for months. Public embarrassment today might justify calling for a restructuring one that places all decision-making firmly under her guidance. Mally's eyes widened. So she played both sides, restoring order while quietly encouraging disorder. Not entirely, Perbrite replied. But I suspect she nudged matters along when opportunity presented itself. Before further speculation could unfurl, Mrs. Hardstyle herself approached, her expression arranged into gentle concern, though the edges still held the familiar rigidity of long-standing authority. "Inspector," she began, "I've spoken with dear Eunice. I feel confident we may restore harmony in due time. For the sake of the society, I believe it would be wise to well-frame today's events as a learning experience." Perbrite regarded her with a polite but measured expression. "Learning experiences often begin with full clarity, Mrs. Hardstyle." She smiled thinly. "Indeed, and I believe we have achieved that clarity," Perbrite replied. Her eyebrows lifted. "Almost?" Perbrite looked toward the chalkboard, the donation box, and the slightly adjusted cake stand. There were small actions today, corrections, more than sabotage that neither Mrs. Lavender nor Mrs. Pomeroy admitted to. Adjustments consistent with someone who values order but dislikes overt disorder. Hardstyle stiffened. "Inspector, surely you are not implying," Perbrite continued gently. "For example, the banknotes in the donation jar." Mrs. Lavender rearranged the first few, but the alternating pattern was perfected later, a refinement beyond her emotional impulse. Mally added, "And the chalkboard numbers, someone rewrote them." "Just a little." Mrs. Hardstyle's color rose. I simply ensured things remained presentable. If I had not intervened, the event might have descended into utter chaos. Perbrite nodded. "Your intention was order. But your actions were small, though they contributed to an already unstable situation. In trying to demonstrate control, you inadvertently fed the confusion." Hardstyle opened her mouth, closed it, then drew herself upright. "If maintaining standards is a crime, Inspector, our society is doomed." Perbrite's expression softened. "No crime has been committed, but accountability is part of leadership." She hesitated, a rare crack in her practiced composure. "I meant only to preserve the society's dignity." "It will survive," Perbrite said quietly. Perhaps, in fact, with a little more humility than before. Mrs. Hardstyle inhaled deeply, then exhaled as though releasing years of accumulated tension. "Very well. I accept that my adjustments were ill-timed. Mally coughed discreetly to cover a chuckle. Perbrite addressed the room once more. Ladies and gentlemen, the events of today reflect a confluence of frustrations rather than criminal intent. With greater communication, I believe future events may run more smoothly. Mrs. Wymington muttered, they could hardly run less smoothly. Mrs. Hardstyle shot her a warning look, then sighed. Perhaps we should adjourn for the day. As the attendees gathered their belongings, subdued but reflective, Perbrite moved beside Mally. It seems, he observed softly, that even the gentlest bake sale can reveal the complexities of human nature. Mally smiled, and all over a few crooked cupcakes. Perbrite allowed himself a small chuckle. In Flaxborough, Sergeant, a crooked cupcake is never just a crooked cupcake. The hall slowly emptied, leaving behind only the faint scent of sugar and the echoes of unsettled pride. Perbrite surveyed the room with quiet satisfaction, sensing that the final explanation, complete, orderly, and unclouded, was ready to be shared. Now, he said in a low voice, let us prepare to bring it all together. By the time Perbrite called the committee members together again, the hall had nearly emptied. Chairs scraped softly as Mrs. Hardstyle, Mrs. Wymington, Mrs. Broxholm, Mrs. Perwin, and a still sniffling Eunice Lavender gathered near the center table. The remnants of the morning's chaos lingered in disordered cloths and half-finished cakes, but the atmosphere had shifted into something calmer. Residual tension softened by fatigue. Perbrite stood before them with the gentle composure of a schoolmaster concluding a long educational field trip. Mally took his place beside him, discreetly flipping open a notebook as if ready to record official pronouncements, though Perbrite suspected he mainly wanted something to occupy his hands. Ladies, Perbrite began, this morning has brought us a number of disruptions. Some intentional, some accidental, and all reflective of deeper concerns within your committee. Before the day ends, it is important that we establish a clear understanding of what occurred. Mrs. Hardstyle dipped her head, attempting to reclaim authority despite her earlier admission. Yes, Inspector. It is crucial that we present a united front. Perbrite smiled mildly. Unity is most effective when it comes after understanding, not before. Mrs. Wymington crossed her arms. Well then, Inspector, please tell us plainly who is responsible for all this nonsense. Perbrite looked at her with a soft patience that hinted at his answer. Several people. Mrs. Wymington. Each is motivated differently. He turned first to Eunice, who shrank slightly under the attention. Mrs. Lavender's feelings of exclusion and embarrassment led her to make subtle alterations today. She poured citric crystals onto her own cupcakes, rearranged the tea labels, sorted the donations, and altered your Victoria sponge. Wymington bristled at this. My sponge deserved better treatment. Perhaps, Perbrite conceded, but feelings seldom arrange themselves neatly. Eunice did not intend to harm the society. She simply wished not to be dismissed. Eunice whispered, I'm so very sorry. Wymington's sternness softened. Well, your sponge lettering was quite tidy at least. Perbrite continued before emotion could derail the explanation. Mrs. Pomemeroy, acting independently, altered the raffle list, tampered with the cupcakes by placing the citric crystals within reach, and moved the cake stand all in an effort to demonstrate that the committee lacks proper standards. Perwin sniffed. I've said as much for years. Hardstyle shot her a warning glare. Not now, Perwin. Perbrite returned his attention to the group, and third, his gaze rested on Mrs. Hardstyle. Some minor adjustments throughout the morning came from your own interventions. You corrected the donation arrangement, rewrote the chalkboard totals, and adjusted the cake stand after its return. Hardstyle straightened defensively. Someone needed to maintain order. Quite so, Perbrite said gently. But your attempts to restore order in the midst of hidden disorder added to the confusion, reinforcing the impression that sabotage was ongoing even when the situation was stabilizing. Broxholm, who had watched the exchange with quiet relish, interjected, "Hardstyle, you always do insist upon control." Hardstyle stiffened. Someone must. Perbrite let the silence linger just long enough for reflection to settle. Then he spoke with quiet firmness. "What we have witnessed today is not a criminal plot, but a collision of pride, insecurity, and long-standing grievances. Each of you contributed, in some way, to the climate that allowed frustration to find such a peculiar expression." Perwin muttered. "Peculiar is putting it mildly." Perbrite continued calmly. Mrs. Lavender felt unseen. Mrs. Pomemeroy felt unappreciated. Mrs. Hardstyle felt overburdened. Mrs. Wymington felt scrutinized. Mrs. Broxholm felt superior. Mrs. Perwin felt ignored. Perwin gasped. "Well, that is hardly, though perhaps somewhat accurate." Perbrite allowed a small smile. These difficult feelings, if addressed openly, might have prevented today's disruptions. Instead, each found its way into small acts, some mischievous, some corrective, all disruptive. Wymington cleared her throat delicately. Then, "Inspector, what happens now?" "Now," Perbrite said, "you may choose to rebuild the society with better communication. No formal charges will be filed. Mrs. Lavender and Mrs. Pomemeroy will each provide written statements of apology, and I trust the committee will accept them with grace." Hardstyle exhaled slowly, her composure softening into something more genuine. Yes, that would be appropriate." Eunice dabbed at her eyes. "I didn't mean for everything to fall apart." Hardstyle placed a tentative hand on her arm. "Eunice, perhaps we have not always been as welcoming as we ought." Broxholm chimed in, "We do rather corner the conversation, Hardstyle." Wymington sighed, "And we correct one another far too often." Perwin lifted her chin, "And we blame Eunice for too many things." The group fell into a contemplative quiet. Perbrite clasped his hands behind him. "It is my hope that next year's bake sale might be less dramatic." Mally muttered under his breath, "Hard to top this one." Perbrite cast him a sidelong glance but allowed the remark to pass. Inspector Hardstyle said, gathering herself, "On behalf of the society, we thank you for your patience. We were not at our best today." Perbrite inclined his head. "The truth is, Mrs. Hardstyle, the society has shown exactly what makes Flaxborough remarkable. It finds harmony even after chaos, provided its members are willing to listen." Eunice looked up timidly. "Will we still hold the sale next week?" Wymington hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, and perhaps Eunice should oversee the display table." Hardstyle blinked. "Oversee?" Eunice's breath caught. "Do you mean it?" "Yes," Wymington said with a reluctant but sincere smile. "You have a good eye for presentation, and your cupcakes, sabotage aside, are truly quite lovely." Eunice looked overwhelmed, nearly unloading another wave of tears before Broxholm quickly produced a handkerchief. Perbrite felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest. Not triumph, Flaxborough seldom offered that, but a small, steady reassurance that human foibles, once illuminated, could be gently steered toward better conduct. He turned to Mally. "Sergeant, I believe our work here is done." Mally nodded. "Until next year's disaster. One disaster at a time, Mally." As they stepped toward the door, the hall behind them was already transforming. The committee spoke in calmer voices. People resumed cleaning. A few even laughed. The sharpness of the morning had softened into something almost companionable. Perbrite paused to take in the scene. The crooked cupcakes, now boxed away as evidence of an unusual but deeply human mystery, sat neatly on the counter. Beyond them, the women of Flaxborough's society, fraught, imperfect, earnest, began rebuilding their fragile unity. Perbrite exhaled with quiet contentment. "Now," he said softly, "let Flaxborough return to its comfortable routines." And with that, he stepped out into the cool afternoon air, leaving behind a hall filled with restored, if slightly bruised, harmony.